Okay, what did we learn last week during the short week? What did we do? What did we build?
We're working on the movie seats.
Working on the movie seats. What was let's do a little recap of that. What concepts did we use on the movie seats?
I'm not sure about concepts, but I remember we were working on setting the seats to be empty or selected or unavailable.
Yep. What data structure did we use to make that work?
Is that, I'm not looking at it. Was that the if-else statements?
We did use an if-else statement to make that work. Let me just share my screen as a refresher of what's going on here.
Yeah.
So we started out with our movie data, right? And looking at our movie data, what data type is the movie data variable? This is for anyone. I'm not picking on Jennifer here.
An object?
An object. And what do we know about objects? Objects always have what?
Key value pairs.
Key value pairs and our curly braces. So what we made our keys was The Godfather, Shawshank, Casablanca, and Citizen Kane. What data type are our values?
Properties.
Like
what data type though is that?
Also objects?
Array.
Also an object. It's an object because again, we have another curly brace and we store the data about that variable in the key value pairs again. So even though The Godfather is an object and movie data is an object, we're using the value of the key The Godfather to store another object with more information about that movie, the price and the seats. Now, finally, we get down to our seats, and what data type is that?
Arrays.
That's an array. And because we want to store a list of all of our seats, we want to store data about multiple seats in there. But our seats are empty because what we ended up doing was generating out the code here. When we generate this code, we use 2 for loops. Well, why did we use 2 for loops? Because we need to generate not only every row of seat, but actually we used 3 for loops, excuse me. We needed to say we need to generate the seats for each movie. That's what our outer for loop is doing. Our second for loop is generating out 8 rows of seats. And then our inner for loop is generating out the columns of the seats. So we really have a for loop that's not only running 8 times or another 8 times for each of the row, but another 4 times for each one of the movies. Now, what we do there is we go through and we make an empty array for the row of seats. Then we push in the data about each seat, whether or not that seat was selected or whether or not that seat is occupied. And we used a random here to say occupy roughly half the seats. Then we take that and we push that into our array. Once we go through all 8 seats going across the column, we realize we're done processing this row. So we use another push to push it into the movie seats. Well, where's our movie coming from? That's coming from our outermost for loop here. That means all of the seats we're generating here, we are pushing into the seats array, which is coming from our object up here. Now we get more practice with our for loops by coming down here and saying, hey, whenever we call this function update HTML, we're going to loop over the selected movies data to get the rows and the columns. And based off of that, this update HTML function is basically taking all of the seats arrays that we've generated here and converting that array data into an HTML element. That HTML element is using an if statement to figure out some data about the seat, whether or not it's occupied or selected. And if it is, we add in different classes to the HTML we're generating. Then we also hook in another HTML element here to say if the seat is not occupied or selected, we use that to store the row index and the column index so we know what seats are getting clicked on. And then we also add our on click here for the seat clicked. Finally, the computer comes down here and is listening for two different events. One is when the movie is changed. Go ahead and get the seats data and store it in selected seats so that we can use that in our other functions. And then we also use our seat clicked. This is the code that's saying, hey, go get the data row index and the data col index out from the attribute based off of the target of the click event, store that in the row index and the col index, then update our data structure over in the JavaScript side to update the data. Then finally call our update HTML function, which is looping through all of the data that we updated on our JavaScript side to regenerate out the HTML to store that into the browser using the DOM, the document object model. Going through that example, do we have any questions about what we covered last week? Tuesday was almost a week ago, and we want to make sure that we've got full understanding of this code before we move into anything else.
Can you go over the deconstructing thing again?
The deconstructing of the dot entries or somewhere else?
Just in general, because if you scroll back down, the $sign and then this right here, yeah, that
Here?
part. Yeah, I kind of forgot what that was about.
Okay, so what we used here was a template literal. So this is a, you notice right here, this is a backtick instead of a single quote. It's kind of hard to tell that apart from a single or a double quote. But what we did there is a template literal unlocks two different things for us. One, it allows us to use multi-line strings. So if I come in here and I hit enter, you notice how VS Code freaks out and it's like, whoa, whoa, this string isn't over yet. Well, we're ending it down here, but JavaScript doesn't support multi-line strings with single or double quotes. So what we ended up doing here is we used a double quote, which allowed us to break this down into multiple lines of code. That's
You
the
mean
first.
a backtick?
I'm
You
sorry.
said a double quote.
Sorry, the backtick here. Yes, the backtick is what allows us to do a multi-line. The other thing that the backtick allows us to do is use this template syntax, the $sign curly braces. So basically what the $sign curly braces is doing is it's saying pause whatever string is coming here, go get the value of row index and drop it in wherever the $sign curly braces is saying. In other words, it's an easy way to concatenate a string without having to break up the string into multiple parts, right? So if we said something like const string 1 equals I have a, and let's do const animal and say I have a dog, right? Normally what we would have to do is say I have a, stop the string and concatenate in my animal and then add in the period, right? And while that is pretty clean, oftentimes we need to concatenate multiple strings together, and that gets a little messy. So the other way we can do this is say, use our backticks and then say, I have a, with our $sign curly braces, put in our animal and then add in the period. These two lines of code are doing the exact same thing. One of them is a string, and then we're concatenating in the value of the variable, and then we're adding in our punctuation at the end. The template literal is saying, hey, we can do that all in one go. We're going to have our string, And then whenever we hit a $ curly brace, we're going to take whatever the value is of that variable, drop it into the template literal wherever those $ curly braces are, and then add in the period. So if we did something like console.log str1 is equal to str2, this would log out true, because to the computer, they're the exact same thing. This template literal syntax is basically a quicker way of adding in a value of a variable without having to use concatenation.
What does row equal again? Row index, does that equal the selected movie seats or?
Yeah, so up here, the dot entries is breaking down our for loop before. So before we said for row of entries, and that was giving us basically each individual array in here, right? What the row index does is it tells us what number row are we on. Are we on 0, which would be the first row, or are we on row index 7, which would be the 8th row, the last row? So this row index is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 every time that it loops through this for loop here.
And that's why we're able to like delete the HTML, right?
That we use this row index here in order to drop it
Generate-
into the HTML. So when we come down here for when a seat is clicked on, we're able to pull the row index back out from that HTML and update the proper seat down here.
Okay, thank you.
Beautiful
I just-
questions. Good way to
I-
start the class. Go ahead, Brian.
I have a real quick question, Max, on the template literal syntax. So I see you did something a little different with the call index in there. I guess I take it that when you use backticks, if the variable is on its own line, like you don't have to include it in the curly braces. Or
No,
because I would have.
I just
Yeah,
showed
because-
this as an example. So if you
Okay.
if I put all of this on one line, it might be a little bit easier to see. Basically, I used basic string concatenation here instead of the template literal syntax. So basically, I
Okay.
said the template literal ends with this backtick, then concatenate the string in here, and then concatenate another template literal in here.
Okay.
So this is going to be the exact same thing as saying this.
Okay.
Those two are going to create the same string, but I just wanted to show the concatenation there is achieving the same goal as using the template literal syntax right up here.
Okay. Thank you. That explains the difference.
Okay, any other questions from any of this movie seats code before we move forward? Doug posted a link to the template literals documentation in W3 schools. Sometimes learning the concept in the project itself is a little more challenging, but what's nice about W3 schools is it kind of just shows you those basics. So if you are still like not completely getting the W3 schools, I'm sorry, not completely getting template literals in this code, which we'll be using more in the tic-tac-toe project coming your way. The documentation at W3 schools can be helpful to read that and kind of understand the concept or the definition of it before we actually use it in a project. Any other questions, any other concepts from last week that you want to go back over, anything in general?
Could you please review? Oh no, that's Google Fonts, never mind. No.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move forward. We're actually going to do a self-assessment tonight. So what we're going to do is review kind of all of the concepts that we've gone over. And I'm going to try and do this. Oh, I'm sorry, I posted the wrong link. I meant to post this link, though you can get to that link from the first link, which is tonight's outline. So we're going to be doing a self-assessment, right? So I'm going to go through. I'm going to write some code off the fly, off the cuff, and just do a quick overview of the concept, right? And then from there, pretty easy for you guys to answer kind of hey, am I at a 1 here? I've never seen this before. I don't know what you're talking about. Or am I at a 5 here? So this self-assessment is going to take us, probably up until the break to complete. I'm going to go through each one of these concepts, and then you can kind of score yourself, and then we'll move on to the next one. This is required for everyone to fill out. And the reason why we're doing this now is because we're at that, let me see, let me do the math. 10 divided by 24, we're 43% of the way done already. And there are a ton of concepts that we've learned. We're headed into the last week of JavaScript here. And so we want to make sure that these concepts are not only sinking in, but they stuck when we learned them, because some of this stuff is going all the way back to week 2, right? Going back to when we first started writing our code and getting into our HTML structure. So that's why we spend the time almost at the halfway point here to go over these concepts, because the next 3 days, 3.5 days worth of class, we're going to be working on our most complicated project so far, right? That tic-tac-toe board, breaking it down into steps, going into the engineering, get more practice with our JavaScript, working with data structures, working with the DOM. All of the concepts that we practice in that Movie Seats app, we're also going to be practicing with a little bit of algorithm scripting for tic-tac-toe. But we do this self-assessment today. I mistakenly actually had it scheduled for Thursday, and then I went, wait a second, if I get all of these responses on Thursday, I've got no time to go back in and help you guys, recover those topics, or realize that, I made a mistake on my part. I didn't spend as much time on this, and 90% of the class is like, I don't know what you're talking about here. The other point of this self-assessment is to be a little bit of a confidence booster for you guys, because at this point, it can feel like JavaScript is just flying by you and you're like, whoa, I'm not learning any of this, right? So this self-assessment is a nice way to kind of pump the brakes, especially right after a break, coming in with our refreshed minds and going, okay, how much of this stuff have I actually learned here? And so that's why we do this self-assessment. Hopefully I've bought everyone enough time. Anyone have any problems pulling up that self-assessment and getting into section number 2? We're going to go through this step by step. I'm going to cover each one of these topics, so you don't need to fly through that form. You may find that you don't actually think you know it, and then when I start going over it, you're like, oh no, I actually got that. I remember all of that kind of stuff. And so that may change your answer a little bit. So don't fill it all out right off the bat. Just wait for me to kind of go through each concept, and then you can decide what level you are at and self-assess from there. Any questions?
Self-assessment number 1, is there a second one in here? I don't see.
No, number 2 will be coming later in the program.
Oh, okay.
Okie doke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open briefly a new file that we can kind of play around in. And that bumped my screen share. I'm not quite sure why, but that's okay. Give me 1 second. You definitely do not need to code along here. This is just so you guys have an idea of the concepts. There will be nothing to turn in here, and what I am coding out probably won't be particularly helpful to reference. But it's all captured in the recording just in case you want to reference it back. Okay, so starting out, HTML page structure, right? This is going all the way back to week 2 of the program. We have been cheating and using a exclamation point enter. That's our Emmet syntax. But basically, our HTML page structure is broken into 3 areas. We've got our HTML tag, of course. That's where the content of all of our page and the metadata about the page are held. Inside of that, we have our head tag. The head tag is telling the browser information about how the page should work. Our head tag includes the title, which is what the tab name shows up as. It also includes any links to external style sheets, whether they are style sheets we have made or links to Bootstrap style sheets. And then finally on our page structure, we've got the body, right? And that's what shows up. That's what the end user ends up seeing. Inside that page structure, we may be using different divs in order to lay out our content. We may be using the grid system and all of that kind of stuff. We understand that tags can be nested inside of tags. We can have divs inside of divs. But for the most part, our HTML page structure comes down to our HTML tag, our head tag, and our body tag. As I'm going over this, if I shake loose any questions that you didn't realize you had about this content all that time ago, but now that you're feeling more comfortable with it, a question has popped up, that's totally fine. Feel free to interrupt me at any point here, and I can definitely cover those questions. Some of these will go quicker than others. Okay, moving on to the next question about HTML elements and attributes. An HTML element is basically whenever we use a tag. A div tag is an HTML element, just like an H1 is a element. And a p tag would also be another element. Blow that up a step further there. So an HTML element is basically whenever we have one of those HTML tags, whether it's an H1, a div, or any of those. An HTML attribute is whenever we do our equals. So if we say class equals purple, a class is the attribute, and the value of the attribute is purple. So we've seen a couple different kinds of attributes already. We've seen class tags, we've seen IDs, we've seen style tags where we can make a border of 1px solid green. And most recently, we have actually seen something like data row index equals some number, right? So all of these are our HTML attributes. Attributes are pretty basic. They just have the attribute name and then also the attribute value here. And all of this information goes inside the div HTML element or tag in order to give the browser more information about how that div should behave, or more information about that HTML element in particular. Okay. HTML nesting and indentation. We are already off to the races on all of that nesting and indentation. Just in the natural course of me writing some code, I created a div, and then inside that div, we have 2 child HTML elements, an H1 and a P tag. So we know that these H1 and P tags are inside of this div because it is before the closing div tag. That's the first way. Second way is we can see that it is indented a level deeper, right? We can see this is indented over 1 step. That is not important to the computer because the computer understands that, hey, because they're between the div tags, I know it's in there. But it's helpful for us to be able to see, oh, that div tag isn't closed yet. So all of the styling that's up here, this border, for example, would be around both the H1 and the P tag there. We indent whenever we go into a new block of code. A block of code is different in every language. In HTML, we would consider this a block of code because it's inside the div. In JavaScript, we would consider it a new block of code whenever we see that curly brace, right? So for our for loop or our functions or a Trying to think when else we use curly braces, but we indent a level deeper in order to be able to understand, hey, both of these elements are inside this parent div. Okay, moving on to CSS style tags, links, and inline. We actually already covered one of these. This is an inline style tag. It is a quick way for us to write some CSS to directly apply to this div. We have two other ways of writing our style or our CSS. We can use a style tag up in the head where we can target our ID number 1, and then we can say we can add in our color there. That is the second way of writing some CSS to apply. That's using the ID selector. And then the final way is we can use our link rel equals style sheet. And we can put our href on there to some file called style.css. I didn't create that file in this example, but the general idea there is whatever CSS is in that file would be pulled into our index.html. So it would be applied directly to this page. Style tags using our link, and then also using our inline down here. Moving on to our CSS selectors, properties, and values. We already wrote our first selector. Our selector is basically saying, hey, browser, this CSS coming in this curly brace applies to wherever you see an ID of 1 on the page. The three most common selectors that we will use is the ID, which we've already done, the class, which we are able to use with the period, and then finally, we can target a HTML element directly without using a period or a hashtag, and we can, adjust different properties based off of that selector. We also get into properties and values. Properties are whatever is on the left side of the colon. The value is whatever is on the right side of the colon. The accepted values are dependent on the property. In other words, for color, we're actually expecting a color or a hex code or something similar. However, for the something like border needs more information, right? It needs to know the thickness of the line, the type of the line, and all of that information. Everything here is considered the CSS value. Anything on the left side is considered the CSS property. There are probably roughly 100 CSS properties, maybe a couple more than that, but those are all defined in CSS documentation. Moving on to the Bootstrap grid. The Bootstrap grid is whenever we are using our div class row and our div class column. Basically, the grid allows us to create different size content. So we can add in a col 8 and say 75% of the screen, and a div class col 4, and that would take up 25% of the screen. The Bootstrap grid is based off of our 12-column system. Our 12-column system is used here. So when we say 8, that's going to take up 75% of the screen. What does that leave us? 12 minus 8 is 4. So the rest of the screen is taken up by that col 4 there. That allows us to lay things out in a grid and a row and column fashion. Our columns always go inside of rows. We are able to target different breakpoints or different screen sizes by adding in MD or SM, basically targeting the different size screens from small all the way up to extra large. But we are able to do that and say, hey, on a medium-sized screen, I want this to take up a 4, but maybe on a small size screen, I want it to take up the full width of the column. Any questions so far? I know this is boring, but hopefully when we get to JavaScript and those concepts, this will be a good place to shake loose any questions. But if anything comes up so far, definitely interrupt me.
Yeah, I just wanted to review that part. So a medium screen, would we want to put all 3 of those? For a large screen, we'd want it to be a 4. For a small screen, we'd want it to be another number.
Yeah,
And-
so you can kind of chain them together. You can say, hey, on a medium-sized screen, I want it to be an 8 and a 4. On a small size screen, I'd like it to be 12, so that they are taking up the full width. But then maybe on a large screen, you want to make it a 6 and a 6. You can chain these together and say, based off of the screen size, this is what I want the width of the column to be.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
Beautiful.
'Cause I forgot about that.
Yeah, and we don't need to use those breakpoints. Oftentimes we'll say like, hey, we want this to be the size of the column no matter what the screen size is, but it's a quick way of making our content responsive without having to use media queries directly and kind of targeting the screen sizes ourselves. Okay, moving on to our Bootstrap components. Bootstrap components are whenever we use a pre-built component that Bootstrap has made for us. The easiest example of this, and probably the hardest to implement, is a nav bar. We need, whenever we're using a Bootstrap component, 9 times out of 10, we'll have the documentation open because in order to use a pre-built component, we kind of need to know what classes or what HTML structure they're expecting. So when you go to getbootstrap.com, you can go to the docs, and then over here on the left side, they have form information, the content layout information, and then down here are the components. While I said navbar is the easiest, understanding the card is probably a little bit more simple. Basically, there are some, if we want to use this pre-built component with all the styling, the border, the card title, all of that stuff, and use it and add in our own content, what we can do is use this HTML structure here where they're already defining classes like card title, and card text for us. If we copy this code and of course have the link tag for our Bootstrap included in our own code, it is a quick way to use a pre-built component, basically something that is all styled out. So there are a whole bunch of components over here. We just scratched the surface with buttons and cards. I think we used a little bit of the forms, and then we used the layout, right, of the CSS Bootstrap grid. But the general idea here is, hey, when we create things, when we create our websites, we don't always have to create them from scratch. We're able to use some pre-built components, copy this code right into our HTML, and modify it from there to take advantage of some CSS that Bootstrap has built. And with all of that said, that gets us to the finish line of the overall summary for HTML and CSS. Give yourself a score there, and then take just 2 minutes filling out that comments field of how do you feel the portfolio site was the major project that we built here. How are you feeling about HTML in general? Are there any sections we should revisit? Or are there any comments of things that you would like revisited? Or anything in a one-on-one that you would also like to spend a little bit more time on?
Good. Gonna answer that now.
Yeah, spend a minute filling that out, only because it's hard to go back in the Google form once we move on to the next section. So I'll give you guys a minute and shut up.
Hey, Max, I have a MacBook question. My mission control is not working no matter how much I swipe up or down.
Okay.
Any ideas how to fix that? Should I just restart?
System settings, Apple system settings or system preferences.
Mhm.
From there, mine may look a little different than yours because I'm on the latest operating system, but it should be under trackpad. And then if you go from trackpad to more gestures, there should be one that says mission control, and it should be set to swipe up with 3 fingers.
Very weird.
If your system settings is set to that and it's still not working, I would go ahead and reboot. If it isn't set to that, go ahead and turn it back on.
Thank you. I'm gonna have to restart it. Thank you, though.
Yep. All right, where are we at? We good on comments, or do you need another minute on those?
Just another minute, please.
No problem. Good to go? Cool. Okay, so moving on. DevOps, unfortunately, I cannot give you a visual on all of DevOps, but I will go through each one of the individual sections there. I will tell you guys that as a developer, everything that Nathan covered in his week of class are things that I use every single day as a professional developer, right? Some of them, of course, I don't do every day. I'm not buying a domain name every day just for fun. However, I use Git every single day for pushing my code, for collaborating with my team, for making sure my code is backed up. And I will say at least once a year, I have a new domain name that I buy, or some DNS that I need to set up, or some project that I need to deploy out onto the internet, right? So the concepts that we have this broken down to here is basic Git and GitHub. Do you understand the difference between Git, which is the all the commands you're using with committing and pushing and pulling, and GitHub, which is the host of Git, right? That is basically how Git runs up in the cloud. That's where we push our code up to. So do we have the basic understanding of, hey, my code is what we call unstaged? We need to add our code to the commit. We need to tell our commit what information needs to go into this commit, what files. Then we need to write up our commit message so we understand what we are committing in, a basic summary of it. Then we go ahead and push that up to the cloud, up to GitHub, and are able to back up our code that way, or potentially collaborate on our code. So basic Git and GitHub operations, creating a new repository, either cloning or adding the remote to the repository, modifying our code using git add, and then pushing that committing and pushing it through Git. So those are your basic Git and GitHub operations. We will be using more of Git when I come back next week. Believe it or not, this is your last week of me for 2 entire weeks. Ryan is coming in next week to teach you guys all about APIs and about just how the internet works in general. So really fun 2 weeks coming up starting next week. So we got 1 more week of JavaScript, then you'll be using your JavaScript pretty heavily in all of your API work. And then I come back and start teaching you guys React right before the Christmas break, right? Or the winter break. So we are off the last week of the year. That week off does not count as one of your 24 weeks. So if you actually count out on the calendar, the cohort goes 25 weeks because we take that week off for winter break. So anyway, next week, you will start with Ryan and learn all about basic internet concepts. But when I come back in with our React code, because we'll be working with multiple files, we're actually going to do a callback to Git and start using Git to turn in our homework assignments. That will give you more exposure in practice using Git, because the industry uses all different kinds of tools, but somewhat surprisingly, Git is somewhat a standard no matter where you go to work. If you are working in a collaborative environment, which 9 times out of 10 that you will be as a developer, you will be using Git and either GitHub or some other cloud host. So starting the week that I come back, we'll start leaning into Git a little bit more, which also makes it easier for you to build up your portfolio and be able to show off some of your code. So basic Git and GitHub, words like commit, push, pull, add, GitHub, remote or cloud, repository, those should all be terms that, you know, you're not scared of, that you've got a basic definition that you can go off of.
I wouldn't be able to tell you the definitions. I remember what they did, and you know, my memory of it is okay, but I'd need more practice.
Knowing what they do is the most important part of the definition, so to speak. But that is certainly why we'll start bringing it back in more in the second half of the program, so that you do get more practice with it. Git is one of those things that you kind of struggle to use for a while. And then you get to the point and you're like, I don't understand why this was hard for me to learn or use in the first place. Because once you do get comfortable with it, it's like second nature, right? Like it is very easy to use it once you learn it, but that initial learning curve can be a little tough, right? So knowing what those commands are doing or why we need those commands is really the most important part of Git. Okay, what's the point of add? Because we're trying to commit our code in. Well, what does commit mean? It means we're taking this stuff that we're working on and saving it into a repository. Well, what's a repository? It's just a list of all the different commits and all the changes we've made. Okay, now that we've got all of that working, how do we get that up to GitHub? Well, we're going to push it up to them, right? And then, well, what happens if things change at GitHub and other people push to GitHub? Well, we need to do the opposite of push. We need to pull that back in. That's your general basic understanding of Git. Towards the end of the program, I think it's week 21 and 22, Nathan comes back in and starts showing you more advanced Git concepts. But between now and then, we'll start bringing GitHub back in and Git in general for the second half of the program once Ryan is done teaching. Okay. Moving on to the next topic here is buying a domain and setting up DNS. And this is something that I think Doug can attest to, that it's something that you need to do once every 6 months or so. And because you do it so infrequently, you never remember how to do it. And then on top of that, infuriatingly, DNS takes some time to propagate. So oftentimes when you buy a new domain and set up all the DNS, you do everything. And even if you do it 100% right, you still got to wait 30, 60 minutes up to 24 hours for it to work. And as software engineers, we're so used to being able to test it and get instant results that we immediately go and think we did something wrong because it's not working. And in reality, all that it does is take time for that to work. With that said, basic concepts here: DNS, domain name system. DNS is basically the settings behind our domain. The domain is basically how we link our domain up to our hosting, whether that hosting is on GitHub pages, whether it's some server that we've deployed, whether it's email information. DNS is all about telling our domain name where to point to, how to get to where our code actually is living. So buying a domain, you should know a term like a registrar, whether that's Namecheap, whether that's Google Domains, whether that's the worst hosting company in the world, GoDaddy, wherever it is. Sorry, a little opinionated on GoDaddy there. The general concept or flow of buying a domain name, knowing that it's an annual fee, knowing that we can go to wherever we've bought our domain name and manage our DNS, and then very basics of, hey, we use a CNAME or an alias records to point our newly purchased domain name at our hosting, or we use something like an A record, which is an IP address, to accomplish the same goal, or we use an MX record in order to tell our domain name where to send our emails to. So DNS is something that I've been using it forever, and even I can't say I've mastered it because, much like Doug, I need to look it up every time of how to do it. But general exposure here to understanding, I bought a domain name, it's at my registrar. Next step here is to link it up to my hosting. I can follow the instructions at my host or the instructions at my domain registrar, fill out that basic information, and get my site live on the internet, whether it's GitHub pages or something else. And don't worry, we'll be coming back to all of those concepts in the second DevOps week, week 21 and 22, I believe it is. So you get a little bit more practice with backend or full stack deploys of understanding how to deploy a server, and we'll go back to our DNS records and get all of that set up as well. So that is everything for basic DevOps for that 1 week that you had with Nathan. I will shut up and give you guys a minute to fill out the notes section, and I'm going to launch a poll in Zoom. I know it says, were you able to get your code working? But go ahead and respond to that once you get that note section done for DevOps.
Are we gonna retouch on learning more about the terminal?
Terminal does not go away. Terminal will certainly come back when we get to Node. Actually, Terminal comes back when we get to React in 2 weeks from now, and then it will come back in even more full force when we get into backend and full stack.
Or
Looks like most everyone is done. Anyone need another minute? Okay. So we are headed into the second to last section of this self-assessment. Last section is just an opportunity to put any notes. With all of that said, I realized before I sent the link to the self-assessment that all of the API self-assessment stuff is included in this form and shouldn't have been. So if you, I did modify it to skip over that section, but if you do get to section 5 with the APIs, You can just say, I don't think I learned this at all because they're required questions, and kind of just skip through that section. But anyway, that's section 5 that's coming up after this JavaScript one. So I would be surprised if anyone made it to that yet. Okay. Moving on to seeing our JS output. So pretty easy. Let me start my screen share again. Pretty easy concept here of, hey, when our JavaScript runs, oftentimes we don't know how our JavaScript is running. For example, we could say something like num1 is equal to 5 and num2 is equal to 8. And then we can say const sum is equal to num1 plus num2. Well, if we go to run this code, and I will do that in my terminal. No, I won't. Terminal, new terminal. CD to my desktop, my code, my week 10, my day 1, and my self-assessment. When we say node scripts.js, nothing comes out. And we're like, well, why not? We have our num1 or num2, we added them together and we stored it in sum. That JavaScript ran. The computer did all of that code. Excuse me, but we didn't ask for any output of that. So the console is the easiest place to see our code running. If we do something like console.log and run that script, we would see 13 come out. Now, there are two different places we can see the JavaScript console. If we're using it with Node, our console is going to output directly to the terminal. The other place, of course, we can see our console is if we are in the web browser. And we are on any page. I will just go to Google, right click on it and go to inspect. We can go to the console and see the output of our code here. In fact, this is a pro tip that I haven't showed you guys. We can actually write our code directly in the console and see that output. So I can say something like const sum1 equals 5. And then I can say something like console.log sum1 plus 3 and hit enter and get our 8 as our output there. So we don't usually write our code directly in the console, but it is a quick way to write our code and test our code and see the output of it. So the JavaScript console is just understanding, hey, two places things can come out. If we're writing our JavaScript and running it in the browser, it's going to come out in this console tab, and every browser will have its own JavaScript console, or our console output will be shown in the terminal whenever we write a console log. That brings us to the next concept, which is Node.js versus the browser. Notice this question is not asking, have you mastered Node.js? Because we haven't even scratched the surface with Node. The only thing that we've done in Node is basically made a basic runtime environment where we can write some JavaScript and we don't need to include it in the browser. The general understanding here is if we want any code to run in the terminal, or we want any code to run directly on our computer, we use Node. However, the vast majority of the JavaScript we have written so far executes in the browser and takes advantage of the document object model, the DOM, right? So that is basically saying, how can we make our code interactive? How can we listen for different events? How can we understand that when that event happens in the browser, this JavaScript code is going to run, and when that JavaScript code runs, it's all in the browser to update the user experience or that HTML. So basically understanding that JavaScript we write inside our HTML pages, that's all running in the browser. Node.js is what the computer is running when we get to running servers outside of that browser environment, writing generic scripts. And we will be doing a lot more in Node, but basically just understanding here when our code is running in the browser versus when our code is running in that terminal using the Node command. Okay, moving on to the next section, variables. As you have seen already, we have, data types. Before we get to variables, different data types that we are able to run. We already started with our first most basic data type, which is a number. We have other data types like strings. We have data types that are arrays that store a list of information. They are separated with a comma. We know they are brackets. Those square brackets mean that they're an array. Arrays can store different data types and can store any number of items. And then finally, we've got our objects, which are key value pairs. For example, we could say something like animal and set that equal to our string if we wanted to. So key value pairs. And then finally, I didn't include it in there, but we also have booleans, something like that. And then we also have something like let my var. And if we did a console.log on my var, we would get undefined. So basic data types there. Any questions on data types? And often our data types can be nested. So if we wanted to, we could say something like my list is going to store the array, and then this whole array would be accessible through the object. Okay. Moving on to our variables, we have seen both let and const. The only difference between the two of them is let can be changed down the road. Const is constant. We know that there are older variables that were declared with var, with a var. We know that when we declare a variable, we've got to say what kind of variable is it? Is it a let or a const? We've got to name the variable with whatever we want. And then we also understand that the equal is basically saying whatever is on the right side of the equal is what's going to get stored into the left side of the equal. Not much to add there. With our objects, we have key value pairs there. We understand that there are two different ways of accessing information inside an object. If we wanted to get out the word dog, we could say obj.animal, and that would give us access to the word dog here because that's storing the string. We also can get access using bracket syntax, which is very similar. The only difference with bracket syntax is we can also use a variable there. So if we wanted to say something like name of list is equal to my list, we are able to use that bracket syntax here. And that would get us access to our array. So whenever we don't use quotes in our bracket syntax, it will use the value of whatever the variable is. If we do use the quotes, then it will use the actual key in there to get access to the value that we're looking for. Objects can be several levels deep. If we needed to, for example, if I wanted to get the word cat out here, I can chain my bracket syntax or my dot syntax there to dig in a level deeper, peel back the layers of that onion. You will get a lot more practice in the next 2 weeks digging into objects with the APIs that you'll be working with, because you will not control the data structure, right? You won't really have control of where that data is structured or what kinds of variables it's using. So you will get more practice with that coming up in the APIs. All right, let me try and pick up the pace here just a little bit because we're almost done. If statements, it is a way to use what we call conditional logic. It is a way that we can say if num1 is equal to 5, then we want to console.log this code runs because num1 is 5. Or we can say, we can chain in our else there and say console.log, the number is not 5. We saw conditionals when we were using the movie app to control if the seat is occupied, then output this HTML, else if it's selected, use this HTML, else use this other HTML. If statements are one of the most commonly used structures in JavaScript. We use if statements all the time to tell the computer basically to do a logic branch, or in other words, to say, based off of the conditions when you run, do this if something is true, otherwise do this other code if it is not true. Functions, 2 different ways we've seen them. This is the older style. The other way we have seen functions, the newer way, the way I write it in all of my code, is arrow syntax.
Refresh my memory, where would the parameters go for the newer way?
Newer way parameters go right in here.
Right in the brackets, right?
Right in the parentheses.
Parentheses, okay.
So we could add in param1 here. Thank you for calling that out, because that is important to review with functions. Neither of these functions will run because they have not been called. In order to call the function, we need to say myfunc1, put in the parentheses, and then add in whatever our parameter is going to be. So in this case, we call arrow functions and regularly defined functions the same exact way, still with those parentheses. Parameters can take any kind of data value in there. The general idea here is that when we call the function, myfunc2 is going to come up here, and it's going to run any code that is between the curly braces. This parameter, this argument, actually true, goes up into parameter 1 here. Parameter 1 trickles down into our console log, and anything between our curly braces is going to run whenever we call myfunc2. The idea behind that is that we can write one block of code and execute that code with different inputs, different parameters, whenever we want in our code. In the movie app, we saw that in update HTML. We wanted the HTML to update not only when a movie changed in the dropdown, but also whenever a seat was clicked on. So instead of having to copy and paste that code multiple times, we were able to put it into a function, then call that function in different places that made the code re-execute based off of whatever the parameters were at the time of calling the function, which we do down here. You got 2 for 1 there. I covered parameters and arguments. The only difference between a parameter and an argument is it is an argument when we call the function. That argument is passed into the parameter when we define or run the function. Oftentimes you will hear people call everything a parameter instead of an argument. They are technically not interchangeable, but as developers, we like to think of everything as parameters. We don't really think about them separated out as when we call the function versus when we're running the function. So oftentimes you will hear a developer call this a parameter. It is technically an argument, but they mean the same thing.
So where are parameters and arguments covered on Tuesday's class?
Yes, Tuesday's class. Well, maybe. Let me see. So our update HTML did not use any arguments or parameters. We know because there are not any parameters defined in the parentheses there. However, that does not mean we're completely off the hook. Things like event is considered a parameter, and then we use that event parameter to get information like the get attribute. So even though we didn't call, when we called update HTML didn't need any parameters or arguments. We do still have that concept of a parameter when we defined our seat clicked and our on change. And then you can see when on click gets called that seat clicked, here is our argument event that is getting passed into the parameter right here.
Okay.
That's also a question of mine. Like, I don't fully understand when you will want to put something in the parameters or when you want to just leave it empty.
When you don't need additional information in order for that function to run, you can leave the parameters and arguments blank.
Hmm.
However, if this update HTML needed more information on what to run, that's when we would define some additional parameters inside that function. As we get into more JavaScript, that will start to make a lot more sense. Oftentimes, when we are working with a certain pre-built framework, the framework will tell you what parameters they are passing into you for you to use. So we'll get a little bit more practice with that as we go. The movie seats app that we just created is still considered like medium to intro level JavaScript. Tic-tac-toe will get into the kind of that medium high level of JavaScript. We won't be tackling any of those like advanced projects, but JavaScript doesn't go away. So we'll be doing, we'll be getting more practice with JavaScript when we go into React. And then when we get into full stack, we'll be using JavaScript and Node on the back end. So we'll get more and more practice with parameters and functions and refactoring our code as we go, as we learn more concepts.
Got you.
It booted me out of my code. Open recent. There we go. Okay. I don't know why arrays is so far down on the list. We covered arrays here. Arrays can have any number of values. They can hold any data type that JavaScript supports. We can nest arrays inside of arrays, and arrays have different functions that hopefully you can remember back to your free code camp homework to review. So things like push. Push is probably the most common array method that adds data onto the end of our array. We access specific indexes using our bracket and then our number syntax. That index is 0 indexed. So if we want the first item out of the array, we're going to use 0. And then there are all kinds of functions like pop and unshift and splice and all of that kind of stuff on our arrays to work with the data inside of our arrays, adding things on, taking things off from the beginning, taking things off the end, all of that kind of stuff with our arrays. Dot push is the function that I use probably 90% of the time. I use shift every now and then or splice. Can't remember if it's shift or splice to remove items from our array. But those are the two most common ones that we use. That's not to say that those other functions aren't helpful, just that we use push normally most of the time because we want to just add data on to the end of the array whenever we're working with it. Okay. For loops. We have seen two different kinds of for loops. They both use the for syntax. The first one is actually, you know what? Let me just, well, it doesn't matter. The basic for loop, or the most basic type of for loop, uses our, oops, I should say let. Uses 3 conditions: what the iterator is going to start at, when the loop or the condition should keep running. Think about that as kind of the if statement for the for loop. And then finally, what I should increment by, or our incrementer should increment every time the loop is complete. Inside of our loop, we are able to print out something like this loop has run, oops, I times. Shout out to a template literal that I use there. This is our most basic for loop broken into the 3 different conditions. We also can use a for loop where we can say let const data of, I don't know why I keep on doing consts, for let data of ARR, console.log our data. This is a for of loop, still considered a for loop, but basically what we are doing is looping over our array up here. So we would get dog, cat, 5, 6, and false out. this console.log would run 5 times because we are looping over it. We use our curly braces there, so we are getting a new block of code, just like we used for our functions, and we can nest for loops inside of for loops. The general idea here is we can either tell it the number of times we would like this loop to run, or we can tell it to loop over an array or object's worth of data in order to make sure that we have access to each individual piece of it.
Hey, Max, it's looping 5 times because of the I is less than 5,
Correct.
but doesn't the plus add 1? So,
We're starting at 0.
oh, okay. Okay, so
We
what
could do 1 and less than equal to 5, and that would also make the loop run 5 times.
okay.
Okay. Almost over the finish line here. We have basic while loops. A while loop is going to check the condition. We can say while keep running is equal to true. Console.log loop running. And then we can do something like let loop count equal 0. Loop count plus. And then if loop count is greater than 5, set keep running to false. I feel like I overcomplicated that example, but the general idea here is the while loop checks to see if this is true. If it is true, it's going to run all of the code inside the code block. Then once the code block is done running, it's going to go back up to our while. It's going to check to see if this is still true. If this is still true, the loop will run again. Eventually, some condition needs to change inside of our while loop that will stop the loop from running. So this is a quick way to loop over things. A while loop is commonly used when we don't know how many times the while loop needs to run. While loops are very infrequent. You see for of loops the most in JavaScript code, or a traditional for loop. However, while loops and do while loops do exist. They are syntax that you should know. So adding that on there. Okay. DOM inner HTML is the general notion of I can get an element by an ID or class. I will call this ID1. Inner HTML is basically saying I can take anything in my JavaScript and set that into my HTML. So I could say something like str here. I can generate out that HTML in any number of ways using a for loop or pulling any of my JavaScript data in. But the general idea here is whenever we see document is what is making our JavaScript reach into our HTML. We're using getElementById, which is a function provided by the document object model. This is an argument for the getElementById, so it knows what element it's getting. And then we get access to all different kinds of properties from that, one of which is inner HTML, which would take whatever is on the right side of our JavaScript equal sign. In this case, it is going and getting the str using a variable, getting the value dog and putting that back into our HTML. Obviously, we need the argument in order to line up with the HTML that we are running this JavaScript in. We also have access using the document object model, the DOM, to get access to something called onClick. OnClick needs to equal a function. And what we are able to do here is say ID1 was clicked. OnClick is one of many JavaScript events that we've used. The other one off the top of your head, anyone remember the other one we've used?
OnChange.
OnChange. So we used our OnChange during the select dropdown, right? In order to say, hey, when that movie changes up at the top, we want this code to run. So a JavaScript event is basically saying, hey, whenever a user has interacted with the page, we are able to access that event and then use information about it to to update our app based off of the way we want. Okay. That is it for JavaScript. Are there any JavaScript concepts that we have covered that is not in the self-assessment that you would like me to review?
Yes, iteration, because
Okay.
yeah, I keep thinking we add to it, like the whole less than 5 thing. I was thinking it would count to 6, but like no. So
Okay. So the way this works is the program says, hey, we're going to start the loop for the first time. What do you want to start I at? And here we're going to say I is equal to 1.
mhm,
We come in here and we say, is 1 less than or equal to 5? It is. So what prints out here is literally going to be this loop has run 1 time.
right.
Then it comes down to this curly brace and it says, that's it. I'm done running this iteration of the code. So I need to know what I need to add to I. I++ means I'm going to add 1 to I. So now we ignore this and we say I is now equal to 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 5? It is. So we do this console log again and we see the loop has now run 2 times. So we keep going there. We say 2 plus 1 is now 3. Is 3 less than or equal to 5? It is. So we print out 3. We do that again. It prints out 4.
Keep
We
going
come
to-
up here. Now, when it's 4, we add 1 to 4. We get 5. Is 5 less than or equal to 5? Yes, it's equal to 5. So we print out 5.
and
We
then
hit
that's
this curly
5.
brace. Now I is 6. 6 is not less than or equal to 5. So we skip over all of this code, and this is the output.
Oh, that wasn't too bad. I was just thinking that it has to loop to 6 or something. Okay. Thank you.
So I technically does reach 6, but because 6 is less than 5, this console log will never run, and that's how we break ourselves out of the loop.
Gotcha.
Same concept down. Same concept down here for the while loop. When we use a while loop, whatever the condition is, we need to make sure that there's some way that that condition gets updated to break itself out of the loop and move on to the code that's down here.
When I practice loops and stuff, I think I mess up with my lets because I always get the output of it saying that I risk running an infinite loop. And I'm just like, what am I doing wrong?
Yeah, I would have to look at the for loop for that.
Mhm.
But in general, you want to make sure your for loop is broken down into the initialization of your iterator, your if condition of when the loop should keep running, and then what you want to increment I by.
Okay.
Elandra asked about concatenating. We've actually done concatenation all through this code. Concatenation is basically whenever we add 2 strings together. So if we wanted to say the number is not 5, and then we wanted to add in something else, we could say period, and the number is still not 5. Basically, all we're doing is we're saying take this string and mush it right next to this string over here. So concatenation is whenever we add strings together, we chain strings together in order to get the output that we want. This would be another good example. If we wanted to print out the number of times something has run, we could say something like this. We're doing 3 concatenations here. We're concatenating this loop has run with whatever the value of I is. In this case, it will be 1 through 5. And then we're also adding in the word times at the end. So concatenation is just the mushing together of multiple pieces of data in order to get one long output. Anything else for JavaScript or anything in this self-assessment that was not covered or listed as a topic that we would like to review? Okay. Finish up your comments in the JavaScript section. hit the next button. If you do make it to the HTTP and API section, just go ahead and say, I don't think I learned this at all, and go through all those questions. It should skip you over it, but I don't know if it will or not. The last section is just a general notes section. I will be reviewing this before tomorrow's class. So if there are any topics that people come in fairly low on, I will make sure to find a way to really emphasize that in our final tic-tac-toe project, which is coming your way after the break. So go ahead and finish up this self-assessment. Fill out your last notes for JavaScript and for the overall note section. Go ahead and submit that. You guys will not lose any points based off of where you have assessed yourself. This is more just for us to figure out where we need to spend more time as a class. When we come back from the break, we are going to dive into tic-tac-toe, building out our user interface, and really making sure that we're breaking down the steps, the engineering steps, to make sure that we understand how a project of this scale that's going to take us 3 days to complete, make
And
sure we're
then
capturing all of that
for
information. Okie doke, take a break. I will see you guys at 7:25. But before you go on break, submit your assessment, please. See you guys at 7:25.
Hey, Max,
Yes.
just an update. Kalai said that she was able to get onto 2 other Zooms in the US.
Zoom just hates Hack Upstate. Okay, I will.
Do you want to make me a co-host and I could poke around during the break?
I don't know that co-host is gonna do it.
Okay.
I think it's gonna be somewhere in the Zoom settings. Here, let me just stop the recording before I forget. Later on, so that you can add this project to your portfolio, you are more than welcome to. We're gonna go super basic on our styling here. But like I said, you are welcome to add one later if you would like. In our index.html, we're going to do our exclamation point enter. We're going to update our title to tic-tac-toe. And then in our body tag, we are going to create a script with an src to our script.js. We're going to head over to our script.js file and create a console.log hello. We're going to go live in VS Code, and we're going to see a white page, which looks like nothing is happening. But if we right click and inspect and head over to our console, we should have our hello in the console. If we do, you are all caught up and you can vote in the poll. Again, created 2 files, index.html and script.js, all inside the week 10 day 1 folder. We made our index.html. All we did is add our script tag and adjust our title tag. Then over in our JavaScript, we created console.log hello. We made sure our script tag was added here. We popped it open in the browser and we made sure hello is coming out. Give everyone a minute to catch up there.
I forget the shortcut next.
For the HTML template,
Mhm.
exclamation point enter.
Thanks.
No problem.
I kept doing all kinds of combinations.
Did you post that live share link?
That would be a step that I missed.
Network. Exclamation dot enter.
Exclamation point enter. In your index.html, once
Yeah.
you create the new file, you should be able to just click in it, hit
Oh,
exclamation point, and then enter.
I kept not hitting it fast enough, and so it would just give me an exclamation point, and I'd be like, why?
Everyone, one more minute to get their files set up, and then we will dive in here.
The share is in Slack.
Yes, I will put it in Zoom as well.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Doug. You beat me to it.
By seconds.
Okay, we are good to dive in here, I think. Anyone need one more minute?
Just a minute.
So for this project, I'm going to pretend to be a client. And a client comes to you and says, I would like you to build me tic-tac-toe. That's all the client says. And that is actually, believe it or not, a detailed enough project brief in order to build out everything that we need to do over the next 3 days. So we are going to get started, but as we go, we are going to update this week 10 day 1 outline. So you guys have an idea of everything that needs to be done step by step in order to accomplish that. So what do we think the first step is in building tic-tac-toe?
Well, we need to write some HTML for it, I would think.
Would it be the grid or?
Yep, it's exactly what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to and what's going to be in our HTML? The user needs to be able to click on the different spaces, right? So what are we going to use in order to pull that off?
We're gonna access the DOM.
We are going to use the DOM, but we're going to kind of set us up to say, hey, let's create write the HTML using buttons to make the 3x3 grid. Right? So we come over to our HTML, we make our div ID, we're going to call this board. And then we're going to make a div for the first 3 buttons. That's going to be our row 1. And we're going to say button. And it's not going to have anything in it. And there's going to be another button and a third button. And that's our first row. If we save that and go look at it in the browser, we see our 3 buttons across. Okay, it's pretty ugly. Let's see. Can I put it won't let me put a space in it. Let's try a little hack. See if that will work. Okay, so I did an ampersand and then NBSP and a semicolon. That stands for a non-breaking space. That non-breaking space is basically telling the browser, we just want an empty space in there, so set the height to the right dimension for us. So we are going to do that in all 3 of our buttons. And then I can copy this whole div and paste it 3 times. And believe it or not, that is going to be the tic-tac-toe interface that we will be working with for the next 3 days. Better learn to love it because it's not going to get any prettier. So if you would like to make it prettier on your own, you are more than welcome to. So what we're starting out with is our grid. And I come back to my outline and I think we have write the HTML using buttons to make our 3x3 grid. Stop there. Make sure you guys are caught up. All right, so moving on from here, what's our next step?
I want to say adding on like the X and, oh wait, no, never mind, that would have been.
Yeah, so that's kind of our objective, but let's break that down a little bit more. We said our objective is to make it so when a user clicks on one of these X's, right, we are going to make the X show up here. How are we going to go about doing that?
You need to write an onclick in the JavaScript.
Add an onClick when a button is pressed. So I come over here and I'm going to say document dot get element, and we're going to use something new. We're going to say tag name. And the element that we're going to get by tag name is we're going to get all the buttons. And to see if that's working, I'm going to store that in a const called all buttons. And then I'm going to console.log out all of my buttons. So I go back over to my browser and I take a look in my console. And what do I see? I see an HTML collection here. But whenever we are looking at this, this looks a lot like an array to me. So I can't just add an onClick to all 9 of these all at once. I need to tell the computer, hey, each one of these I would like an onClick on. So what we are going to do is say for let button of all buttons console.log the individual button. And I come over to my code, and now I got button, 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 and I got it 9 times. Well, now I have access to each individual button, so I can say button dot onClick equals some function that is going to console.log button clicked. So I come over here and I click on a button and I got a button clicked. I clicked on another button and I got a button clicked. Okay, so instead of having to add an onClick to all the buttons over here, or instead of having to add a ID to each one of them and add the onClick to all 9 of them, I was able to say, go get me all the buttons, store that in all the buttons, then loop over all of the buttons to give me each one of the individual button. Then on each individual button, add an onClick, which is going to be a function that console logs out button clicked. Okay, so let's go back to our document. We said add an onClick when a button is pressed. We did that. We should maybe modify that to say add an onClick to all the buttons when any of them is pressed. Okay. Now what?
Should update the button with the X.
We should. So what we're going to do is we have access to the button, right? So we can say button.inner HTML is going to equal X. So I come over here click on a button and I get an X. And click on another button and I get another X. Okay, we're on the way there. The only thing that I don't love is that whenever we have an X, the X takes up a little bit more room than that individual space. So I lied to you. We're going to write a little CSS. We're just going to target the button and say the button is going to have a min width of, I don't know, let's try 20 pixels. Is that going to be enough? Let's try 30 pixels. Too much. 25. There we go. Now our buttons aren't shifting around on us. Okay, so we're going to make it so when the user clicks on a button, the X shows up. So I'm over here. I'm going to take a break and let's pull there, make sure everyone is good. We should have it so that when you click on any one of these buttons, this is all the JavaScript we've added and one style tag up here to set the minimum width of the button so the buttons don't jump when we click on one of them. So over here, we click on any one of our buttons and we get an X showing up.
Sorry to bother, but
you're fine.
when I click my button, it doesn't change the width changes. So button. Never mind. Just kidding. Just kidding. I know what I did wrong. Sorry.
No problem. That's why we're here.
It's slower than you are to type. But
Oh, Max, I do have a question about the game, and this is kind of going forward. Maybe you'll get to this. How are we handling O's? Because I would think one thing like 2 consecutive clicks would be the opposite, shape. So if the last click was an X, the next click would be an O, or depending on how like this is configured. I don't know if like the other player would be at a different computer. Just throwing out there because
that is a good question for the client, right? You start building something like this, and then you go, oh, what's supposed to happen here? When they said build a tic-tac-toe game, I could spend a ton of time making it so that 2 people can play tic-tac-toe on the same computer, and I could give it to them, and he could be like, well, why isn't the computer making a move, right? And so that would be a good question for the client. Hey, when you say build tic-tac-toe, do you want to build this for a multiplayer tic-tac-toe? Or do you want to build this so the computer can play against us? To make this a little bit more interesting, we're going to make it so we can play against the computer.
Would adding color to it like help it stand out? Like, I don't know, black and red, for the circles and the X's.
You could.
Yeah.
We're not going to do a ton of styling on that, but that's certainly something that you could do if you wanted to add it yourself.
Gotcha.
Okay, so we've got our inner HTML showing up this X, but we just decided that we want the computer to be playing as well. And we're going to decide that the computer, at least to get started, is going to be pretty dumb. The computer is just going to pick a random spot to play, and it's going to play there. Okay, how do we go about that? Well, we've got it keeping track of the X. We then need to say, hey, after the user clicks on something, the computer needs to make a turn. But what we're saying is we don't want the computer to make any random turn. What's the other condition that we need to think about when the computer is picking a spot of where to go?
can't pick a spot where there's already an X.
Exactly. So what we want to say is make the computer take a turn at a random non-occupied spot. Okay, well, we've done random before. We know we can get that working again. What the question is how do we keep track of knowing whether or not that spot was taken or not? So what we're going to do is we need to keep track of what spots are already taken for the computer. So what we're going to say is const board equals an array, and inside that array, we're going to have 3 separate arrays. And they're all going to start out as empty strings. Those empty strings are going to represent a spot that has not been taken yet. So we've got our board. Our board has 3 inner arrays that are representing each of the rows. And then each one of our columns is represented by an empty string here. So what we want to do is say, based off of what button they click on, update this array. But we run into a problem here. How do we know what button they clicked on? So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to our HTML and we're going to add IDs to each one of the buttons. So I'm going to call it ID B1, B2, B3. And then I'm going to just copy all of them, paste them down here, and keep going. B4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
And then we need an event listener.
Well, no, because we're getting the elements by the tag name button. The tag name button hasn't changed. So our on click is still going to work. So we don't need a new event listener, but what we can do is console.log out the event.target.id. So I come back over to my tic-tac-toe, I click, and I get B3. Well, we know B3 is always going to be our top right button. So I come over here, and I click on another one, and I get B7. Okay, but what I want to do is update the board. Should be a let, sorry, my bad. I want to update the board based off of what button ID they clicked on. So I'm going to say, if the event.target.id is equal to B1, then in my board, where is B1? B1 is the top left. That means that we need to fill in this spot up here. That is in the first row, so index 0. And in the first spot, that is index 1. Index 0 as well. I want to set that equal to X.
Could you repeat that part, please?
Yeah. So B1, if we look at where our B1 is, we know that this button right up here is B1.
Mhm.
So what we do is we say, where is that in the array that we're trying to represent? It is in the first row. And so because it's 0 indexed, we say 0 here. And then where inside of this row are we trying to put the X? We're trying to put the X right there.
Thank you.
So we can also say, else if the event.target.id is equal to B2, then go to our board. We still want to be in this first row. So we're going to say 0, but now we want to be in the second string or the first index. So we're going to say 1, and that is going to be equal to X. And then we're going to keep going. We say else if, and we're going to copy and paste this a couple times.
Real quick, Mac, I kind of see where this is going. This is just a general question. Would this maybe be a good case for a switch?
I hate switch statements. But yes, it
I
would be.
know you said that before, so but yeah, it just seems like this might be one of the cases where
You definitely could do a switch statement here as long as you don't forget your breaks, which is probably the reason why why I hate switch statements the most, because it's very easy to forget a break at the end of that. But you could definitely use a switch here instead of an if else if, and it would operate the same exact way. So I need to
Got it,
be
thanks.
careful here. B3 is in my first row, so it's still 0, but it's in my second spot all the way over. Now for my B4, I am now down here, right? B4 is this button right here. So I need to be in my first row, but my index 1 row, but index 0 column. That means that button 5 and 6 are going to be in 1, 2. And then finally, we've got a coordinate system going on here. It's going to be 2, 2, 1, and 2, 2. I'm not wearing one of them right now.
We always laugh when we play bingo, whenever they call 22 and they say, that's I-22.
Okay, so come over here. I'm going to give you guys a break in a second to catch up. I click on my X, and I'm like, well, what good did that get me? I don't see any output here. So what we're going to do is we come back over to our code, and we want to know if all of this is working. So we're going to do our console.log, our board, come back over to the browser, and if I click that middle X, I get an array of arrays printing out. But if I click on one of those arrays, I can see my X is in the proper position. And in fact, if I go somewhere else and pop that array back open, we're not only keeping track of this X, we're keeping a running tally of all the places the user has gone. And now we're storing that in our board here. Okay, so let's go back to our outline, and we're going to say, before we can make the computer take a random turn, we also need to modify this step to say, and update a multi-dimensional array based off what button was pressed to store the user's moves. Maybe let's put that in a separate bullet. So we're saying based off of what button was pressed, there's our event target ID B1, store it in an array, and it's multi-dimensional because we're using 2 coordinates, and what we're storing is the X or the O. Okay, so now we need, let me pause there and poll and make sure you guys are all caught up in case you need another minute.
Artrell has a question, Max.
Go for it.
It's broken, Max.
Oh,
Share screen.
All right. All right. So I was trying to go through line by line. Make sure that my JavaScript looks okay. It looks decent. My HTML looked decent.
Okay, so let's take a look at the error message.
Mm-hmm.
The 404 is saying not found.
Right.
What is it trying to look for?
This web address.
Yep, and what is that file name?
It looks like it's supposed to be my JavaScript.
Okay, say the name of your JavaScript file for me according to the error.
HTTP 127.0.0.
Yep. What's the file name?
I I don't know. Should I click it?
No. Read that file name out to me. Read what's underlined in green.
Oh, script.js.
Nope.
Hmm. Am I not seeing it in green? I thought you okay.
Does
The
that say
whole-
script?
Skipped. Okay. Okay. All right. So yes, thank you. And it didn't show up as a okay.
Like 90% of the time, errors are typos.
Yes. And so the reason why I will start backing off a little bit on giving you the exact answer is, okay, what is the computer trying to tell me in the error message? 99% of the worst bugs are when there's a bug without an error message because you have no idea where to start. But that error message oftentimes is trying to give you a hint as to what's wrong. So when it's saying not found, you can think, okay, well, what is it trying to find? It's trying to find my script. Where did I tell it to find the script? I know that's somewhere on line 33. Let me make sure that all of line 33 is perfect before there are any issues.
Now that's what I looked for. I didn't see line 33. So that's why I was confused. And my brain automatically wants to read descriptive as script. So that's why okay.
Yep.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
We build a conversational tool at work that uses synonyms, and synonym is the god-awful worst word to type as a developer because it's YNON, and it's just really hard to get the synonym spelled right, and I can't tell you how many times my code has not worked because I spelled synonym wrong. And then you get to a point where you just want to type synonym instead of synonym.
Awesome. Thank you, Max.
No problem. Okay. We good? We need one more minute?
1 more minute.
Sure.
Max, with the tic-tac-toe, could you have used the data attributes like you did with the movie seating column and row index?
We sure could. Yeah, we used an ID here. If we wanted to add in a something like data dash row data.
You're not sharing your screen.
Thank you. If we wanted to use something like data row index here is equal to 0, we could come over here and console.log out our event target get attribute and then use our data row index. That would definitely work. Just wanted to show that DOM bridge, we get access to more than just basic attributes. We get access to like things like the ID. So it really depends on if the computer is generating out the indexes for me, I would probably lean into using that data flow. But in programming, there's never just one way to solve the problem. So doing something like this data row index is definitely another alternative to know the column and row that the button was clicked on. But I just preferred, instead of modifying all of my HTML, I thought it would be a little bit cleaner to do most of the heavy lifting in our JavaScript. Could be argued either way of which way to do that. But yes, definitely could do it that way.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got our board updating. Now we need the computer to make a random turn. However, JavaScript doesn't have a random function where you can say, I want a number between 0 and 2. There's math.random and all kinds of ways of doing it, but it drives me crazy that is not built into JavaScript. If only we could make our own reusable function that allowed us to generate a random number. So I'm going to say generate random number between 2 numbers, and Google at this point knows more about you than you know about yourself and should be auto-suggesting JavaScript as the top answer. Because remember, we don't want a function in Python or Java or any of those. So I hit enter on that, and I get this first Stack Overflow answer. And I scroll down, and it says random int from interval min and max. Oh, that's actually what I want. So I'm going to just copy this whole function, head back into my JavaScript, and paste that in. However, whenever I am taking someone else's code, I don't want to just flat out plagiarize that and call it my own. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this link from Stack Overflow, come back over to my code and say source and paste in that whole link. No, you're not going to get a copyright strike on your code if you copy and paste off Stack Overflow. But when I am going back through this code and I want to reference this or know where it came from, I'm going to really benefit from having this link, so I know, hey, if I need to go back and reread that answer and know where it came from, I have it in my own code. However, I don't like that it's called random int from interval. I just want to call that random number between. And you know what? This function syntax is the older syntax. So I'm going to convert that to say const random number between is equal to my min max as an arrow function. And now we don't really need to dive into all of this code here because this is supposed to generate my random number between 0 and 1. This is code that I would recommend copying and pasting either from that Stack Overflow answer, or you can also copy and paste it right from my live stream. This syntax is very, very easy to get wrong. And if you do get it wrong, it will be generating random numbers way bigger or smaller than we want them to generate.
We're not gonna change the math.floor or anything?
Nope, all of that is part of it. So the math.floor is what's making sure we don't get a decimal number between 0 and 2.
Got you.
So we're going to come down here in our for loop, and we're going to say const random, actually we're going to say let random row equal a random number between 0 and 2. And we're going to let our random column equal a random number between 0 and 2. Well, why 0 and 2? Because that's our indexes. So if we pick a random one, a random row, and a random column, those random numbers all need to be between 0 and 2 because we don't have an index 3. We don't have a column 3. So what we're going to do is say console.log instead of the board, console.log out our random column and our random row. So we come over, we click a button, and the computer picked 1, 1 as the spot it was going to go. Then we click on it again, and we get 1, 0. Okay, that's kind of cool. We click on it again. It's doing our random numbers, and if I keep going, eventually I'll get another random between those two. So what we can say is, hey, when the computer makes a turn, go to the board, use the random row and the random col, and place an O in it. Artrell.
When the computer picked, was it supposed to be visible on the board? Because I missed it if it
No.
was.
Nope, not yet.
Okay, we just know it through the console log.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to console log out the board. I click a spot, and if I open this array, we will see an O in a random spot. I'm gonna stop there. What you should see is if you refresh the page and click on any button, it should show you the array of where the computer is going only in the console. We don't have it updating our HTML yet. We only have that happening in the console. Up there, if anyone needs help on their own code, let me know.
Yeah, I'm just looking for an error. Math at 12.
So make sure your line above that has the correct equals and the equal arrow at the right spot.
Okay. I have them backwards.
Zona.
Yes, so I get an error. It says script.js 1518. I'm just gonna show you.
Go for it.
So this is the error.
Random int from interval is not defined. Okay, so go back to your code and
Right here.
yep.
So I'll just have to copy this.
And before you copy it, make sure you don't have random in the number.
Random number.
Yeah, you're good now.
Okay. Oh, nope. Okay, let me see. Okay, sorry. Press the wrong button.
Your copy and paste hates you tonight.
It does. Totally does.
Okay, well now you somehow
Oh, and
yeah, there you go. Good catch. Beat me to it.
perfect. All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
No problem. Good work.
Thanks.
I'm not getting the 0 in my console. Can't see where the mistake is, Max.
Share your screen. Let's take a look.
Can you see it?
Click on a button. Okay, and open up your arrays there in the console. And you can see it went at 0.
Didn't get to that part. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
But it's not showing the X.
So let's take a look at your code.
Oops. Can't grab it. It disappeared.
Is it minimized?
There it is. Yep.
Okay, and you are missing the IDs on all of your buttons right here.
Okay, thank you.
So you see how we're using this event target ID B5? Well, because they're not over here, it isn't firing any of this information, which is what's actually setting the X into the array.
Yes, okay, I forgot to go back and do that. Thank you.
No problem. Good catch, Doug. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Bobby, go ahead.
Okay, in my console on the browser, it says uncaught syntax error, unexpected token.
Okay, sure. Let's take a look. All right, so my brain immediately goes to the first place I see red, and while it looks like it is down on here, there's actually red starting all the way up here. And what it is mad about is this comma right there. That comma is supposed to be a semicolon, and unfortunately, you copied and pasted that mistake all the way down. So save, and let's see if that fixes the issue for you. You are missing the word event up here. Sorry, higher up on the on-click line. Where did my Zoom tools go? Oh, here they are.
Right.
Yep, right there. Okay, pop open 39. I'm sorry, in your console. If you open this up, you can see your board playing here. The weird thing, though, is that when you clicked on this button, it didn't make a move. And if we take a look, that's B9. You've got your opening curly here, but you don't have your closing curly here. It's all the way down here.
Okay.
So you want to take one of those closing curly braces, or you know what, you should have two of them there. So just add another one right here. And save. And I think you've got one other mistake. Go ahead and scroll up for me just a little bit. Number between board 4. You've got your curlies there. You should only have 2 closing curly braces down at the end. Okay, yeah, so you did have an extra one. So go ahead and take that last one out. And now if you click on that bottom right one, you'll get your array coming out, and that will have the moves in it.
Cool.
So you're good to go. You're all caught up.
Thank you.
No problem. Anyone else need help? All right. Believe it or not, we are at 8:15 already. So we're going to do a quick review of the code that we wrote. And then starting tomorrow, we're going to talk about how we can take our board, which we are updating right here, and make it reflect over here in our HTML. But just to recap what we did, we started with the HTML using buttons to make the 3x3 grid. That was our div ID board over here, and we've got all of our buttons inside of it. We then came over and we said, add an on click to all of the buttons when any of them is pressed, So we came up here and we used a new DOM function called getElementByTagName button. Then we looped over all of the buttons by saying all buttons, give me access to each individual button. When I have access to the individual button, add an on-click event to that. Then we came back over here and we said, make it so when the user clicks an X, the X shows up, or clicks a button, the X shows up. Well, that was a simple one. We already have access to the individual button that we're looping over. So when they click on it, take that button and set the inner HTML of that button to the X. Okay, from there, we said update a multi-dimensional array based off of what button was pressed to store the user's move. In other words, we need to make our new array up here. We stored them all as empty strings, so the positions existed already. And then we came down here and said, based off of all of these IDs that we added, use the row and the column index to place an X in the appropriate spot based off of what ID they clicked on. So we used our if statement here and made 9 of them to say, based off the button ID, store it in the proper position. Then we said, make the computer make a random turn at a non-occupied spot. I'm actually going to take non-occupied out because we haven't done that yet. So we're in here, and I said, well, we need to be able to pick a random spot for it to go. But JavaScript doesn't have a function to make a random number between two numbers. So we went to Stack Overflow, we found this function, we spruced it up by renaming it. This function takes 2 parameters, a min and a max, and then does some math stuff that we don't really need to dig into in order to generate a random number between the min number and the max number inclusive. So now that we've got our random number, we come back down here and we say, hey, we want a random number between 0 and 2 because that's going to pick where the computer is going to go in the row. Then we also need a random column for them to go in between 0 and 2. We take that, we use that positioning in our random column bracket syntax to update our board to place an O in it. That means that one of these spots up here is going to get an O. We finally come down here and we console log out the board. And what that is doing is giving us, when we make a move, we can see the computer is taking random turns. Before we move to vocab, do we have any questions about this code? From top to bottom, you should be able to say what every line of this code is doing and why we need it to do that. So just take a minute, read over this code, and let me know if anyone has any questions before we move on.
Yeah, I have a question right away.
Yeah.
Remember why we've got the arrays with the empty values? Board.
Because if we said, hey, set board 2 to an X, if 2 didn't exist down here already, we would get an error that that index didn't exist. So basically what we do is we start out the board as empty.
Okay.
And because they are empty, we now have a spot to put them when we start generating out the computer moves.
Those are empty spaces. All right. Thank you.
Yes, the empty string is an empty space. Yes, exactly. All right, we're gonna move on to vocab unless anyone has any questions about this code. So the last thing we're gonna do to be kind to our future selves is we're gonna leave ourselves a note right where we left off. So we're gonna come down here and we know we've got the board randomly generating. Sometimes it is more helpful to know where we left off than what we left off on. So we are going to add a note right down here on line 40 that says, for future self, the array is updating in a random spot, but is not updating the HTML yet. In other words, we got the board picking a random spot to go, but that random spot isn't showing up in our HTML when we make a move yet. So we're going to leave that note for our future self right in the right spot so we know where we need to be. And I'm going to switch over to the outline. What terms did we use tonight that you would like to capture as a review?
Math floor.
Math.floor, a built-in JavaScript function that rounds a number down to a non-decimal integer.
Get element by tag name.
Get element by tag name. A DOM function that allows us to access all elements using a certain tag name, similar to get element by ID. However, it returns an array. I think it's so funny that my elementary school typing teacher said that I would never be able to type fast enough because I'm not a touch typist. And now all of you guys are like racing to keep up.
Mhm. And I took typing lessons. Mm.
Those curly braces get you though. The shift whatevers, yeah. They don't teach that in typing class. Okay, anything else?
We did math.random was a part of it.
Generate a random decimal number between 0 and 1.
The and NBSP.
Oh yeah, that was the NBSP, non-breaking space character. A way we can make a space show up in our HTML.
Oh, between the buttons.
Between the buttons, yes. This was our space between the buttons.
Okay.
I don't think we'll need that tomorrow, but you'll see why tomorrow. That is a good one to know though, of when you want a space to show up and HTML is like, nah, spaces don't matter to me. And you're like, I want the space to show. That's when you use your NBSP.
Hey Max, why didn't we make the board a const instead of a let? Like that is if you're gonna change it later on, right?
What are we doing right here?
Oh yeah, you're right. I was thinking like I don't know, like the board itself, but no, you're right. We're going into it.
You got it.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I have for you tonight. I will be reviewing your self-assessments and also making sure that the homework is set up both retroactively and rolling forward. So I will see you guys tomorrow for Tic-Tac-Toe Part 2.
Sorry, what was the homework again?
The homework will be to just comment the movie code from last week. And then this week's homework, I'm working on a battleship exercise where battleship will be mostly made for you, and you just need to complete a couple steps of the code in order to make it fully functional. So that's what I'm working on for homework for this week. But that will be up a little bit later. What will go up by tomorrow night's class is the comment the movie theater code, just to make sure you understand it, and then that will be the homework due next Sunday for this
Okay,
upcoming
'cause
Sunday.
I'll definitely have to watch on Tuesday's class because I wasn't really on there. Okay.
Yep.
Post the last code of the movie seats in the Slack. You only posted when we didn't have the empty arrays
Um,
of the movie seats. When you posted it on Slack for the live, I don't think you posted the last one that we did. You only posted the one where we still didn't have the empty arrays.
you are right. I am doing that right now because I will totally forget and otherwise. Movie
That's
seat.
for whoever didn't have the code that needed to comment it out, because
Yeah, and I will also include these files in the Canvas assignment, so you can also download them from there. But I will paste both that code and tonight's code in there right now.
Okay.
All right, I will see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Fill out your 30-second feedback forms.
Okay,
Thank you.
good night, everyone.
Good night.